welcome everybody to the Fretboard Journal podcast. I am your host, Jason Verlinde. As always, that is John Rauhaus playing in the background. I hope everybody out there is doing all right. I hope everybody is safe. If someone is listening to this and dealing with these incredible hurricanes and floods that are affecting our country, my heart goes out to you. I hope that the conversation you're about to hear is a nice distraction. And today's conversation is with Daniel Patrick, the host of the incredible Mandolins Beer Podcast. Now, for some crazy reason, Daniel had me on his podcast eons ago. I'm not much of a mandolin player. I was certainly flattered to be a guest, but most of the Mandolins and Beer episodes feature some of the most exciting mandolin players alive today. He's up to 240-ish episodes of this thing. And as you will hear, it's opened all sorts of doors for him. One of the coolest doors is that now that Daniel knows all these incredible mandolin players from doing these insightful interviews with them, he asked a bunch of them to be on his new record, and it is out now. It's called Around the Clock. This is kind of a different record than the typical bluegrass mandolin record. It's a collection of covers. So on this record, you get Daniel and Sam Bush playing the Allman Brothers' Blue Sky. You've got Ronnie McCoury and Daniel playing Deal by Jerry Garcia. You've got Jimi Hendrix's Angel with Joe K. Walsh and a bunch of other incredible tracks. This is a fun album. It's available everywhere now. You should all go check it out. And I think you will love Daniel's story. He is over in Charleston, South Carolina, and he tells us all about that music scene. There's a lot of information here. You will like it. I promise you all, even if you are not a mandolin player. Speaking of mandolins, our friends at Stringjoy Strings now are offering mandolin strings. Have you tried these out? Hopefully you mandolin players have. They also, of course, have acoustic guitar strings, electric guitar strings. You can do custom sets of whatever you want. They've got 5-string banjo strings now and so much more. If you use the discount code FRETBOARD when you check out, you can get 10% off of your first order at stringjoy.com. We are also brought to you by Peghead Nation. Another discount for you. You can get your first month free or $20 off of any annual subscription with promo code FRETBOARD when you check out. I just mentioned Joe K. Walsh. He happens to be a Peghead Nation instructor, along with so many other incredible bluegrass and Americana artists. It's really a treasure trove of so many of the musicians we celebrate on this podcast and in our magazine, teaching you all how to play better. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. We are once again sponsored by our friends at Mike and Mike's Guitar Bar here in Seattle. Go to mmguitarbar.com to see their entire inventory. And by all means, please go follow them on Instagram as well. I didn't know how many mandolins would be in their inventory, but lo and behold, I see a beautiful 1918 Gibson Style A in their inventory, along with hundreds of acoustic guitars, amps, electric guitars, pedals, you name it. It's really a fun store. I hope everybody out there is following them and letting them know that they appreciate Mike and Mike sponsoring the Fretboard Journal podcast. Our friends at Collings Guitars and Mandolins are sponsoring the show once again. What more can I say about Collings? When we started the Fretboard Journal, Collings was our biggest inspiration. We loved what they were doing to the industry. We love their creations. You will too. They've got a new Hill Country series of guitars that really, really taps into the vintage guitar sound. Check them out. There are already a bunch of videos popping up on YouTube as well as Instagram. And if you can get your hands on one of these, try it out. You will love it. They had some at the Fretboard Summit. They are truly incredible works of art. Beyond all that, I just want to tell you, if you're listening to this and you are into mandolins, which I'm guessing if you've made it this far, you are, Sarah DeRose is in the new 55th issue of the Fretboard Journal that's going to be mailing really, really soon. So if anybody wants to give themselves a great gift this holiday season, get a subscription to the Fretboard Journal, fretboardjournal.com. Click on the subscribe button. If you haven't seen the magazine in a while, or maybe you were a subscriber and life changed, you should revisit it. We've got a whole new look. We've got a bunch of fresh voices. We still have the greatest production values of any guitar magazine published in America today. And we've really focused on in-depth interviews, photo essays, and beautiful things that you just can't find anywhere. And I mean, even online. Go to fretboardjournal.com. Join us. I would love it. We've got more 2025 Fretboard Summit announcements and even some content from this year's summit on the podcast next week. But we will save that for later because right now we're going to hear this incredible tale of a working musician who happens to play the mandolin, who happens to have an incredible podcast and who happens to have just put out this wild new record that I think you should all go check out. This is Daniel Patrick of the Mandolins Beer Podcast. Daniel Patrick, welcome.
Thanks for having me. This is wild to be on your podcast. I mean, I've been such a fan of your magazine and your podcast. I know I had you on a while back, but it's still pretty surreal to think about all the incredible episodes. I'm still in the craziest Julian Lage phase. Just after listening to that last episode with him about his most current album.
Yeah.
I've bought them all on vinyl now. I've gone to see him in concert here in Charleston. I had signed up for the a Charlotte show he had done with the master class, and I got pneumonia, so I missed that. But I am all in on Julian Lage right now. And Molly Miller, another one from your podcast.
Yeah, well, and did you meet her at the Fretboard Summit? I can't remember.
For 2 seconds on Sunday, she was doing her thing the same time Northfield was doing their little presentation. So I had to go to the Northfield one. Obviously, those guys are my buddies. But her playing, I'm going to hopefully take some private lessons with her because the way she approaches music, her solos are very short and perfect. And the phrasing and the note choices she uses are just so outside of like what I would think to use at this point in my playing career, because I'm so used to like a bluegrassy vocabulary now. So, so I'm hoping to be able to work that out here in the next couple months.
I mean, let's just get right into it. You are a mandolin player, and you've just referenced two guitarists, Julian and Molly, that you wanted to take lessons from. Is this something that you do, on the regular, where it's like I'm going to seek outside my instrument? Partially just inspired by. I'm a big fan of Jake Jolliffe. He's definitely one of my favorite mandolin players, and I took some lessons from him. He's a mandolinist, but he's really he's like a Charlie Parker, John Coltrane kind of mandolin player. I mean, it's just wild to see what he comes up with. And he's on this recording. And again, you can hear a little bit of that, on a CCR song. But yeah, I play so many gigs in Charleston that aren't really bluegrassy per se, just because it's that weird thing of like people think they want bluegrass for 3 hours until you play 20 minutes of straight bluegrass. And then they come up and are like, yeah, so, Amy or Wagon Wheel? I'm like, okay. So we play a lot of songs that aren't strictly bluegrass. It would be cool just to have some little bit more outside sound solos and things like that. And, I'm just fascinated by all styles of music. So, and this is my current thing. I went through a big gypsy jazz phase a few years back too, and stuff like that, but I love kind of looking outside the instrument as well. You mentioned Charleston. Are you a Charleston native?
No, I'm from Michigan originally, and I moved here in 2009. And it's funny because it kind of changed my life. If I was still in Michigan, there's probably a big chance we wouldn't be having this conversation, because in Charleston, South Carolina, I probably shouldn't say this because now people will be like, oh, maybe we should move to Charleston. But you can play music as many nights a week as you can. Like live music is just kind of baked in to the atmosphere down here. So as I was starting to play more music with people I met, I was realizing like, wow, I could probably leave the job I've been at for 17 years and roll the dice and try to play music. And I mean, I was playing 300 plus gigs a year right up until COVID. And you could do that here. I mean, you can play 2 or 3 gigs a day. The other thing is, it's different than Nashville, to where it's like a very tip-based program in Nashville, where, when you play a place here in Charleston, at least what you're making before tips. Like you kind of have an amount. Wasn't always the biggest amount, but at least you knew, what you were making that day.
Was this forgive me, my knowledge of Charleston is largely based around the Bravo reality show, Southern Charm. Did you know this going into moving to Charleston, that like this was going to be kind of a windfall for a working musician?
No idea. I and then just dumb lucked my way into playing So we moved here. And at this point in 2009, I wouldn't even consider myself a mandolinist per se. Like I owned a mandolin and I played a mandolin and I could play some songs on mandolin. But there was a place not too far from where we live called Red's Ice House. And there was a bluegrass duo, a drummer, oddly enough, and a guitar player, bluegrass. So it was kind of weird, but it was this guy, Hank Futch. And I just one day was like, hey, I play mandolin. I'd love to play some music with you. And he gave me the old like, yeah, bring it sometime. Probably thinking like this guy will never show back up. I showed up the next week with the mandolin and he did and rightfully so. He's like, okay, we'll bring you up like the last song of like the second set. And then I played 4 years with him. Like I never, it was just like that song went good. And next thing I know, he's like, yeah, what are you doing next Tuesday? And so that was kind of like my introduction. Come to realize like those guys were like best friends with Hootie and the Blowfish. And, it's like Mark Bryan, the guitar player from Hootie and the Blowfish would show up there all the time. And had I known that beforehand, I probably would have never just assumed I could sit in with this guy who they're like Charleston royalty, their band, the Blue Dogs. So yeah, I would have never asked had I known who he was.
That's wild.
yeah. Just dumb luck my way into it. And I did that for a while, but I was still working full time. I have 2 daughters and a wife and like everybody, you have bills and you're trying to support your family. And I just was, it's scary to leave something. I worked for a big bookseller. I'm sure you could probably figure out who it is for a lot of years, but I was just unhappy, like really unhappy. And I have the greatest wife who was just like, well, if you're unhappy, let's figure this out, and I'm like, wow, okay. So, and at that point I'd been playing way more. I had bought like my first high end mandolin in 2013. And I was like, I'm not playing any more solo acoustic gigs. Cause that was the other thing I was doing was I was just, when I could on my time off, had a couple weekly gigs where I would just sing and play acoustic guitar. And then when I got that mandolin, I'm like, no more of those. I'm just going to start. I'm just playing mandolin from here on out. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to try to find gigs where I can just play mandolin. And then just worked at that for a few years. And the interesting thing is like when you work, it's so funny. Like when you work a job and you turn down gigs because, you only have so many weekends off and, people play weekends mostly. And you don't realize like you probably stop getting phone calls once you say no so many times. People are like, well, your phone's not going to ring anymore because you always have to say no or you have something else going on. And so when I left my job, the purpose behind it was to play music, but I also like started like my own little home inspection company because real estate was crazy here. And I did very few home inspections. Like I tried to do the least amount I could, but once I was available to play, my phone was ringing all the time. And I'm like, oh, wow. So my wife is a college professor and she taught a class in Ireland for a month in the summer of 2019. And I went with her there. And I had one inspection booked for when we got back. And when we were in Ireland, I'm just like, that's the last inspection I'm booking. I'm going to do this just full time. I was at that point was making way more money than doing home inspections, playing gigs. And she was like, yeah, let's do it. And yeah. And so that's here we are.
Wow. There's a lot of old money floating around Charleston. I imagine there are a lot of private parties. Are most of these 300 gigs a year you were doing private, or were they at restaurants and bars and breweries and all the usual stuff?
All the usual stuff. Okay. Works the way though into the private. And now that is definitely like the majority of the gigs. I have 2 weekly gigs that I do here. And then every now and again, an offer will pop up. But for the most part, it's like private events. And it really has been like, it's kind of been taking me all over. I mean, I think we've done private events in like 4 or 5 states maybe this year. And that's the way to go. If you can get into it, it's a lot harder. But yeah, and we actually have done a couple Southern Charm events. Like we did an episode where they were filming a breakup scene. The breakup had already taken place, but like
they're reenacting it.
They're reenacting it. Yeah, I don't know if I'm supposed to. I mean, I don't care. We weren't. They didn't pay us that day.
You mean these reality shows aren't completely real and unscripted?
Yeah, hard to believe. Wow. Hard to believe. So I always called them like the Southern Kardashians.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so I've been able to work my way into that sort of thing. And once you make a few contacts with those and just do a good job and are reliable, those things kind of work out. And everybody thinks, again, like they come to the low country and, they want a low country vibe. So they want bluegrassy sort of music, so. Yeah, it's awesome. And it's been great. And I like everybody I play with is incredible players. And then there's, just like a lot of Alan Bybee, who's an incredible mandolin player. He's won Mandolin Player of the Year at the IBMA Awards multiple times, or once or twice at least. And he's nominated this year. He lives like just, 90 minutes north of here. And so, yeah, and I love it. Like, I can't even imagine. The cost of living is outrageous. Like during COVID, the secret was out that like, wow, Charleston's great to live in. And so everything's been gobbled up, and, like rent for people is outrageous. Fortunately we bought a house, early on, and like the ones down the lull of real estate here. But yeah, it's wild.
At what point, and forgive me for not knowing this because I was a guest on your show, at what point did Mandolins and Beer come into the equation?
So on that, I come back from that trip, 2019. I'm going to play music full time. After a week, I'm like, I don't know what to do with all my time. Like, I don't know. How do you do? Like, what do you do with all this time now? Like I'm playing, like the weekends would be usually 4 to 5 gigs a weekend. But like during the week, I'd have like 1 or 2. And then I would just be like, I felt so lazy and I didn't know how to focus my learning. And like I was saying earlier, like I still have a hard time with compartmentalizing. Like, I want to work on Julian Lodge. I want to work on Sam Bush. I want to learn this old fiddle tune, and, but I started it in 2019 because I was just like, I don't think there's any mandolin podcasts out there. And this will be a chance for me. It was really kind of selfish at first. It was like, I'm just going to reach out to these players that I really like, that I've actually communicated with in person, and see if they'd be cool with interviewing and talking about how they got to where they are playing, and I wasn't sure if it would be 50 people would listen or 100 people would listen. And I got pretty lucky in the fact that Scott from Mandolin Cafe, which is like my absolute favorite website, I'm on the front page of there today, and it just blows my mind every time I see it, and he was just like, I want to support you. How can I support you? And then Dan Gable from Peghead Nation called and was like, I want to sponsor your podcast. This is like episode 2. And I'm like, whoa, I don't think this is how this goes normally, and it just really took off. But I remember like the first couple months being like watching the numbers, like religiously, trying to hope I'd hit like 300 in a week.
Sure.
Just like, oh, wow, and now it's funny to see, like, I mean, there's some days I upload an episode and then I'll like make sure it uploaded and I'll refresh the screen. I'll like go grab something to eat real quick and a drink, and there'll be like 300 in the first 15 minutes sometimes. And it's just like, wow, it blows my mind.
How many episodes are you up to?
I'm almost at 240.
240. A lot of people couldn't name 40 mandolin players.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of mandolin players out there, and it's wild to me. I'm honestly surprised. Like anytime somebody reaches out, I just had somebody for the first time email me and like, wow, I just discovered your podcast. And I don't think that it blows my mind, not in like a conceited way. I just think like, if anybody has ever owned a mandolin, they've either liked it or they don't like it. And that's we're at where we're at, It's just because it's on the front page of the Mandolin Cafe every week for the episode. He puts it on there. And so I just assume that like anybody who's heard of it has either decided they're going to listen to it or they aren't going to listen to it. And then, but there's always people who are just discovering podcasts for the first time still. And it is interesting because there's definitely a market out there in the mandolin world. Like when I'd go to IBMA and have the booth and like some people that are a bit older would walk through IBMA on the weekends, and they still have no idea what a podcast is. They have no idea, to them. And so it's funny that it's yeah, I'm stunned that, it got as like popular as it did. And I'm so thankful and grateful. It literally changed my life.
That's amazing. And what Scott's built with the Mandolin Cafe is just, I mean, it's the definition of a community. It's super cool.
Oh my gosh. The Mandolin Cafe community and Scott is the absolute best. I mean, I had no idea what to do with advertisers. Like I can text Scott for the past few years now and be like, you have a second to talk? Or he'll even, text me, be like, hey, do you have a second? And it's just like, just in the resource I never thought I would have with Scott is, he's amazing.
Yeah. Super cool. And do you, at least behind the scenes, have like some ground rules when you're like trying to decide who your next guest is on Mandolins and Beer? Like, do you have a parameters of like who you want to interview and maybe who you'll wait on a little bit?
Yeah, if you're a mandolin player, it doesn't matter of what your status is to me. Like, I don't look at, well, I can't have them on because I won't get as many listens this week. I don't care anything about that. Like, if it's something that interests me or they're playing something that I am into and am like, oh, wow, yeah, I'll have them on. There isn't really anybody, obviously I'll get people who will email me, be like, I like mandolins and I like beer. Can I be on your podcast? And it's, so, yeah. And then, every now and again, so there's certain ones that it's just, and it also depends on scheduling, like right now there's a lot of releases coming out. So I have, like, I think probably 10 weeks of people kind of scheduled roughly in there. And, so people, I'm just like, I'm pretty booked up. And that was the first, once it kind of got popular, I remember Mike Marshall emailed me and was like, I love what you're doing. I'd love to be on your podcast. And it was kind of like after that, I think at one point I was literally like 20 weeks booked or something crazy. And people were like emailing. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I've got like 20 scheduled. I don't even know how to, I can't take on any more right now. And, I'm sure some slipped through the cracks, and I've had a few of them on since then. So it was never any sort of intentional thing. It was just overwhelming, and it's still a little bit overwhelming. But the biggest parameter is it's just got to be some sort of tie-in to mandolin. Like, I'll have guitar players on. Like, I've had Grant Gordy on, who's incredible. But he plays with Joe K. Walsh, so he's got something. I think if they've got something that a mandolin player or somebody that it can relate to, then I'll have them on. In that sense, like I'd have Julian Lage on in a heartbeat.
Sure.
And that, people would maybe dig that or not, but I think as long as it relates to getting better at your instrument or giving you some sort of inspiration, then I think it's worth having that person on. Actually, I'm going to have Adam. Is it Levy?
Yeah.
Levy. Yeah, I'm going to have Adam on here a little bit because, again, his book that he put out with Ethan just changed the entire way I approach practicing. And I think everybody should read that book. And I met him at Fretboard Summit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I gave him my card and, not thinking he was going to email me back, and he was just like, hey, met you at Fretboard Summit. Yeah. Love to be on the podcast. I'm like, holy cow. Yeah. I'd love to have you. So
He's the best.
Like that's it. He's incredibly nice, and we have a mutual friend, oddly enough, in Bay City, Michigan, which is where I lived before I moved to Charleston. It was a friend of mine, Scott, there. And it's just so weird, like the weird connections of things.
Now, there is a second half of your podcast title, and that involves beer. I have to imagine there are some craft beer makers who play mandolin. Have you had anyone from that end?
I have not yet. It's weird. So with the title, and it worked out good because people know what it is. But like at first, the only reason why I called it that was because that's what my Instagram is.
Okay.
And I was kind of like doing like a lick of the day for a little while. And when I started the podcast, I'm like, well, I guess I'll call it Mandolins and Beer because I had cool stickers that I was already selling for like the Instagram thing. And it was a cool logo. But then it just turned out like beer just became like the final question. Like, what's your favorite beer? Not a whole lot of beer talk. But, I'm toying around, Well, I'll say it out loud. Just first I've ever said to, but I really want to start playing some road dates, especially now that this album is coming out. And I'd really like to play breweries. And then I thought it would also be kind of cool to maybe focus on a brewery, like do like a 4-city thing over a weekend. And then over the course of that week, maybe talk about the brewery in the city that I visited over the course of that, and maybe try to do an episode. I mean, just the thought of that stressing me out right now, though, trying to add another podcast to, I mean, in hindsight, I would have probably done this every other week. Like, it's way more work than I definitely ever thought it would be. Like the scheduling, the juggling of schedules, the editing process. It's a lot more work than I thought. And my buddy Keith from Picky Fingers, he does his Got a Banjo podcast, and he does his every other week. And he's like, "Wow, I can't believe you do it every week." I'm like, "Oh yeah, well, I made a commitment." And that was the one thing, though, when I determined I was going to do it. I remember reading, like, to have a successful podcast, you have to, if you're going to do it every week, do it every week. Say you're going to do it every week, put it out every week, and just do that. And so I was just like, okay, I guess I could have said every other week, but it's worked out. It's worked out great. And I really love talking to all the different people. Like, the past few weeks, I've had some people on that I wasn't necessarily familiar with up until maybe like a promoter had reached out. And, then I listened to it because there's so much music out there that, and I'm just like, man, there are so many great players, and it's just, I love talking mandolin with people. So
cool. So you've got this record coming out. It's called Around the Clock, and it features like a who's who of mandolin players and musicians. I'm assuming most of these, you made the connection via the podcast, and then you felt cool hitting them up saying like, "Hey, do you want to be on my record?"
Yes. Yeah. A few of those names, it was a little bit more difficult than doing it, like just reaching out and texting someone. Like I have Sam Bush's phone number. I don't know. I don't feel necessarily comfortable just texting Sam being like, "Wow, did you catch the game?" You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I know that feeling.
But like there's other people on there that I could do that with, that I've become buddies with. But yeah, so that was the other thing, was with this podcast, I definitely felt like I was suffering a little bit from maybe imposter syndrome. Is like, I played music for a long time before the podcast, but I think people knew me from the podcast, but I also wanted to put a recording out. And I've been able to go to like some cool festivals and IBMA and like jam and hang out and see two mandolin players hanging out and jamming. And I'm like, man, it's something people don't really get to see. I feel like so lucky to sit down and be able to, watch Cyril Hull and Michael Cleveland play a song together, for instance, or something like that, and it's just like, it's insane. And I've always been, one of my favorite things to ask some of these players during the podcast is what else they were listening to, what other music besides bluegrass you're listening to. Because, if Sam Bush and Ronnie McCoury, I think, are the best example of, they probably spent more time listening to Bill Monroe than anybody I'll ever know. But yet they don't sound anything alike on mandolin. And I think a lot of that boils down to the outside influences. Ronnie's a huge Grateful Dead fan, for instance. Not that that's the only thing. And Sam's a great big Allman Brothers fan. And so my thinking was like, wow, maybe I'll approach this as like, let's do non-bluegrass cover songs and just do dual mandolins, or a mandola and a mandolin, and let's just sing them kind of like you would if you were sitting on the couch just hanging out and saying like, "Hey, do you know this song?" And I say that with the weird caveat of Tim O'Brien's the first person I emailed, because I've been covering Drive by the Cars for years. And just for some reason, I just was like, I would love to hear Tim O'Brien do this, because one of my all-time favorite albums is Real Time with him and Daryl Scott.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just recorded. They recorded it in the living room. And so the first email I send is to Tim O'Brien's manager. Because I figure if Tim O'Brien says he's going to do it, it's going to be a lot easier to get some yeses as opposed to all this. And so I sent it, and Tim O'Brien emailed back like the same day. He's like, "Yeah, this sounds cool." you know? And I'm like, whoa, all right. And then I'm like, all right, the song I was thinking was Drive by the Cars. He's like, I've heard of the Cars, but I've never heard this song. And that's so, my idea kind of, except for him, kind of was the only one that didn't really work out. But it was great because I made a demo for him and sent him that. And when we got in the studio, it was the first song of this whole session. And the funniest thing is we recorded it. The first 4 songs, they are with Tim, Jared, Harry, and Mary Meyer. And we recorded at the Tractor Shed, which is Grandpa Jones from Hee Haws, where it's literally the garage where he used to keep his tractor.
Wow.
And yeah, it's amazing.
That's in Charleston?
It was in Nashville. Just outside
of
Nashville. Yeah, I traveled to where everybody was for all these songs. And so I go to the Tractor Shed, and the guy, Mark Howard, he's recorded with, John Hartford. He's the acoustic guitar player on Sturgill Simpson's Cutting Grass albums. He's this legendary guy with all this killer gear. And I get there and setting up microphones, and I'm sitting there freaking out because Tim O'Brien's going to be there in 20 minutes. And he goes, so it's just 2 mandolins and vocals, huh? And immediately I'm like, did I never say this out loud? I was just like, oh no. Oh. And fortunately, after the second song that day, he was like, wow, this is great. I wasn't sure what to expect. This is really cool, man. He's like, you're onto something. But Tim not being familiar with the song, like the intro to the tune, he wrote that like on the spot, just improvising. And I'm like, oh, so that's not even a part of the original Cars song. And then we're doing that, and we're kind of running through it and recording it and just kind of getting some takes down. And we get to the solo part, and he's just like, hey, so instead of like both of us soloing or taking breaks, why don't we just kind of dance around the chord tones together? I'm like, wow, that's crazy. Yes. So there's a wall divider between us, and there's a window, like a small window where we can see each other. And we get to that spot. The hair on my arms is standing up right now. Like, I'm looking, we're like locked eyes. We're playing this part, and I'm hearing it I'm hearing Tim O'Brien's mandolin in my headphones. And it sounds to me like the Real Time album. Like, that's the vibe I'm getting from it. Well, and I'm not I'm not comparing myself to Daryl Scott by any means. I mean, just the tonality of the sound. And it was just, I couldn't even believe it. It was so wild to me that, and that he cared so much to have ideas and not just like, he's been on hundreds, if not 1,000 recordings. And like, he was very concerned about this being what I wanted. It was awesome.
In most of these cases, because there's like this there's a CCR song, there's Jerry Garcia. Like, are these tunes that you normally play in your rotation when you're playing around Charleston? Yeah. I'm trying to think if there were any. The only one that I didn't do was Angel. That's one, but the Hendrix tune where Joe K. Walsh plays Mando cello on, it's the very last track. And I just love that song. And I think of Joe when I think of Jimi Hendrix, when I think of Joe, because him and I text pretty often, and I always try to never say, hey, Joe, when I start the text. Yeah. And that just always just seems like so like cheesy. So, but he's actually a big part of why I did this record too. So when this idea came up, I had hung out with Joe, and he was talking about, there's this restaurant called Husk in Charleston that won like best restaurant of the year at one point. And Joe's a foodie. He's like, oh, I always wanted to eat at Husk. And he was teaching at Alan Bibey's camp in Myrtle Beach. Like, dude, fly into Charleston. I'll pick you up at the airport. We can go to Husk. You can just stay at my place, and I'll drive you to camp and then just fly out to Myrtle Beach. He's like, done. So he flies in, and we go to dinner. We're at Husk, and I'm like, man, I've got this idea for this recording that I'm doing. I'm thinking of these mandolin duet, tunes. And he's like, well, I'm getting a mandocello. That'd probably sound cool. Like, oh, shoot, really? Joe Walsh was interested. Okay. Noted, that was probably September or October at that point. And then in January is kind of when I think the idea hatched in my head. So he was I already knew he had some sort of interest, but then Tim O'Brien was like the first person, that I had sent the email to. I love this, and I love that that is what musicians talk about. It's like where we're going to eat next.
Totally. That's such a big thing. That's the first thing. Like I've been playing quite a few shows like out of town this year. And like, that's the first two things I look at is record stores and food near where we're going to be at, cause I hate being late for anything. So we are obscenely early sometimes for some of these private events, just cause, it's the stress that I feel like rolling in even 10 minutes late to when we say we're going to be there. Just, it grinds me to, cause I pride myself on being prepared, having everything, and being the last thing anybody has to worry about is the music in the band. Worry about, if it's a wedding or whatever it is, you just worry about whatever else you have to worry about. We'll be there, we'll be set up, and we'll be done and out of your way hours before you need that. So yeah, so food and record stores are my every now and again music stores, but like as a mandolin player, it's pretty tough to find a good selection of mandolins anywhere, that's not in a bigger area.
Yeah, so, you kind of know where to go already.
Yeah. And I'm pretty happy with what I've got. And, the odds of, like I'll always play a Gilchrist, and I do love playing all Northfields mandolins. Those things, man, they sound so good. So I'll go to places like that, but usually it is there's a bigger ukulele section by far in every town than any mandolins.
Totally. To circle back to what Tim O'Brien said, like, how did you in your head and when you were talking to these musicians you brought on, like figure out the dual mandolin thing?
I sent demos to everybody. So I demoed everything up and kind of was just like, the biggest thing I wanted everybody to sing on it. Some people we were like, I'll do harmonies. Like Jared really didn't want to sing verses on Hey Bulldog. He wanted to do more harmonies and focus more on mandolin playing. I'm like, that's cool. And same with, I think Mary. But I just kind of was like, do whatever you want. Here's my idea. And actually, Mary, the way I'd sent it to Mary, she had a suggestion to play it a little bit more straightforward as opposed to straight up kind of grassy vibe, which I had for it. And that was a great idea. So we did that. The only one that was really, really specific for the most part was this one with Sam Bush, because I really wanted to do all the harmony parts to that Allman Brothers song, Blue Sky. And there's a lot of them, and they differ at certain points as well. And I mean, I learned that song inside out. Like I went out, I learned it. I charted out like every harmony part on it. I learned all of Warren Haynes' solo from one of the live albums, transcribed the whole thing. But I wanted it to be whatever Sam learned, I will play the counterpart to that. I didn't want it to be like, well, this is what I'm doing and this is what you're doing. Not with Sam Bush, by any means. And it's so awesome. Like that day was maybe the most beautiful musical moment I may ever have in my entire life. Because that day I recorded with Ronnie McCoury in the morning and Sam Bush in the afternoon. And in the meantime, we did this at Stephen Mogen. He has a studio called Dark Shadow just outside of Nashville. And he plays guitar with Sam Bush. And so he knows those guys really well. And his wife made this great lunch and it's at Stephen's house, this incredible studio. And so I have lunch with Sam and Ronnie and the Mogen family, and Ronnie and Sam are catching up, telling just the funniest flipping stories you could ever imagine. And so we get done with lunch, we get on, and Sam just sits down. We sit down on the couch in the control room. He's like, "What do you want me to do, Patrick?" And I'm like, "Wow, whatever you want to do," So he already pretty much knew like what parts he wanted to do, but he still looked at like what I had written out and everything like that. And it was unbelievable to be playing that. And the other thing with this album is I really wanted everything to be as live as possible. And so for pretty much everything you hear from me, that is all the take that we did. And they were just, and mandolin wise, all that stuff is pretty much all also, unless there was like just a glaring flub that could be fixed really quickly. All that stuff is done musically is 100% live for the most part. The vocals, though, like Sam was concerned with doing he had never really done this version. And so he's like, I want to sing my parts after, if that's cool with you. I'm like, you are Sam Bush. You can do whatever you want. Yeah. But we did do the harmonies live together. And we nailed them first time. And it was just to see Sam Bush, like as the playout's going through and he's just listening, and just to see Sam with a great big smile. And he's like giving me double thumbs up through like the window. And I'm like, this is unbelievable. And then he's like, we might be the next Homer and Jethro. And I'm still trying to figure out if that's contractually obligating or not, a verbal statement like that. But it just, it blew my mind to have that happen. And then actually, like the other part too is Ronnie brought a mandola, and we played through the song a couple times just playing. And then what you hear on the intro, he was just kind of messing around with between takes and stuff like that. And Steve Imogen, again, was so great with being like, whoa, wait a minute. What is that you're playing? You should start like that. And so that whole part, that was kind of right there in the studio, kind of like Tim O'Brien's, like, that was never thought up. He just started playing it and it was like, oh, wow. Oh, let's monkey around doing that a little bit, and kind of came up with the version together, which again blew my mind.
Incredible. You and Sam, open invite, Homer and Jethro set at the next Fretboard Summit. You do have to do all the novelty songs too, though.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There might be some we probably can't do, though.
We'll make everybody put their phones away.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the liner notes. I saw you played your Duff F5 a lot.
Yep.
What was your mandolin quiver for this record?
So mine, I played the Duff F5, and then I have a Collings mandola that I got during COVID. That they were they gave me a really sweet price, and I'd really never worked with Collings ever. And my buddy Kim Warner, we talked, him. He was doing live streams, and he did this mandola one, but like the resolution on wherever he was recording wasn't great. And so I just had texted him. I'm like, hey man, what kind of mandola is that? And he's like, it's a Collings. You want one? And I'm like, whoa. I mean, yeah, well, we're in the throes of COVID right now. I don't know when I'm ever going to work again. Yeah, but he's just like, oh, give me a minute. And like an hour later, he gave me a contact at Collings, and they made me just a sweet offer on that. And it's a great sounding one, and actually great to the point where while we were between takes with Tim O'Brien, he's like, man, who makes that mandola you're playing right now? That thing sounds incredible. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's a Collings. So yeah, it does sound really, really good. I love it.
And then you mentioned you have a Gilchrist too?
No, that's I would love to get a Gilchrist at some point for sure. That's like a music store. I meant like you aren't going to see one of those hanging on a wall anywhere for sure.
No, you're not. So you and other mandolin players in the studio together, do you then get does Sam Bush hand you his? Do you get to try out a few things on it?
Yes.
Is there a back and forth? Amazing.
Yeah. The craziest moment again, it's funny. There's a thing on the Mandolin Cafe going around right now on their, on the message board. And it's all like, basically the gist of it is like, is it bad form to ask to play somebody's super expensive mandolin?
What is the answer to that? I'm curious.
It's all over the board. My theory on it is if somebody wants you to play their mandolin, they're going to just offer it up to you. And so, like Ronnie McCoury is like, oh, check out this Gilchrist F5, and I think at this point they probably know I play mandolin too. I mean, because I understand that, like, I let people play mine all the time, but I let somebody play mine one time, like a local player that's a mandolin player sat in and put quite a little mark in the top of the mandolin. I'm like, hey man, that was pretty uncool. But yeah, so, if somebody's got a lore and they're cool with people playing it, they're just going to say, hey, you want to check this out? I don't think I've ever been like, do you mind if I play your lore? I think it's always kind of been offered up. That's a weird spot. So I say wait until the offer comes up.
Perfect.
But we got done recording and we sit down on the couch to listen to the playback, and Sam brings Hoss in and just hands it right to me. and just starts talking about Haas. And all I'm thinking is like, what he play in front of Sam Bush on his mandolin, and it's wild because the overtones, one thing you don't realize, like Mojo was getting all the mics in place for Sam, and Sam's just, sound checking, and I'm standing in the room with them, and the overtones and the way he sounds on that mandolin are so amazing. Like, it sounds even better than you can imagine. And it already sounds good on recordings, but like in the room with him, the way that thing sounds is great. It didn't sound anything like that, obviously, when I held it and played it, but as to be expected. But yeah, so I got to play, I think I played everybody's mandolin. I didn't play the mando cello. I wouldn't even know how to like approach it. I think it's huge. So yeah, it was amazing. Like all the sessions were just, every one of them was like great, and just to the thing that really blew my mind was just like how much everybody cared about each song. Like, everybody was very concerned. And not that I didn't think they would be, but I didn't think that they would be so like it would feel so important to them that I was happy with what they were thinking about doing, because they're all so good. So I just, mistakenly assumed that they're just going to be like, yeah, what I do is magic. So, but they really, every single one of them from top down, was very concerned with arrangements and what they were thinking. And it was wild, and, just total pros, all of them.
Yeah, of course. It's a stacked lineup. It's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. The live thing too was very stressful to do, especially because Tim was really working on some cool ideas throughout it. And I think it took 8 takes to get the version down that we have down of Drive. But I had to sing it in my head like 8 times perfectly, because I was very adamant about doing it live. And I want to be the guy who was like, kept screwing the vocals up, because it's, to make Tim O'Brien do it a bunch of times, so, it was cool. Like when he finally like hammered in what he was looking for, it was just like, that take was just like, that was fun. And then with Harry Clark, that song is a Tom Petty song. It's kind of tricky. We do like a double tremolo thing, and we hadn't rehearsed it at all. We hadn't worked on it in person. We played it once to get sounds, and then we ran through it the first time. Was, could have been the take. I don't even remember what one we ended up using. But Harry Clark, for people who aren't familiar with him, he plays in East Nashgrass, and he's Dan Tominski's mandolin player as well. He played, we probably did 5 or 6 different versions of that song. He played a different solo every time. And every time, each one was as amazing as the last, and completely different. Like nothing similar at all. Meanwhile, I'm pretty much playing the same thing, trying to get the part right that I've been working on, and he's just blazing through these. He's incredible. But he's a good, if nobody's familiar with him, they should check him out, because he's something else. I think he's going to be definitely one of those guys to really watch.
I love it. Well, the album is around the clock. You're always up to a bunch of things. What's next on the horizon for you? You've sold Supreme style shirts that say mandolin. Like, you've done it all.
Yeah. I've got a new t-shirt idea that I'm looking at doing. I definitely want to do some road shows for this album. Once I get the physical product in my hands, I'm going to definitely try to do that. I've got an album's worth of vocal tunes and an album's worth of instrumental tunes that are pretty much all written. A few years ago, I actually hung out at Daryl Anger's house for like 8 hours, the fiddle player, on the first David Grisman Quintet album and Mr. Sun. And we went over a bunch of tunes I wrote, and it was crazy. Like, he charted them out and helped me kind of like fine tune some details and those. So, between the two of those, I think I might have enough to make a record. But I'll tell you what, man, it is expensive to make a record.
Well, you had a pretty, some heavy hitters on yours, I got to say. So.
Yeah, and I did travel, like I flew to Brooklyn to record with Jolliffe, then drove up to Portland, Maine to record with Joe and Matt Flinner, and drove up to Asheville, and then went to Nashville a few times. So there's those sort of costs as well. But, the selling a record it's tough. You know what I mean? Like I feel bad for like, especially I was talking about this with somebody yesterday, but like the younger generation of players, like, when I was growing up, there was, the thought of being a musician, like was this possibility, you know what I mean? Like if you really worked at it, they'd get a record deal and they'd pay for you to at least record a record, that's not really the case any longer, unless you're superstars. But these kids are savvy with social media. I am terrible with it. My social media, I should be way better at it for what I do. But, it has so much work, it's just like another thing. I'd rather be woodshedding. So, yeah. So, maybe another record. I hope another record. There's talks of it with someone. And, I guess it probably depends on how this does. Like, this definitely has the potential maybe to make the Bluegrass Billboard top 10, which would be like so amazing to me. It really, it doesn't take that many records to make the Bluegrass Billboard top 10. Although Billy Strings has an album coming out at the end of this month, which will be
true.
Yeah, that'll eat some stuff up. But so many people stream, and I get it. I just saw a thing though again where like just today, like the Spotify guys, $4.6 billion, and it's just crazy to me that he thinks music doesn't cost anything to make, and probably for a certain style of music, it really doesn't. You know what I mean? Like people can write stuff on a computer, they can send tracks to somebody who's got a home studio and, for a pretty low amount of money, but that still doesn't mean that they should get 50 million streams and only make $5,000. I mean, that shouldn't be the way we work that out. You know what I mean? They should still get what it's worth, but this guy's worth 4.6 billion. So, I always recommend, and this isn't even for my album, but like whenever anybody's on, John Mayer said one of the coolest things one time, where he was talking about how many followers he has on Instagram. And he's like, I put a record out once every 2 years, maybe. He's like, if each of those people that follow me on Instagram just bought the one record, spent $15 once every 2 years, he's like, it would change my life. And he's already doing well. But I mean, that many people for John Mayer, but it's the same for Bluegrass. If 1,000 people who are following like a young band spent $15 the one time every 2 years, this young band puts an album out, that's $15,000 for this young band. That goes like so far, but so buy it and then stream it on Spotify. That's what I do. Like if I find something I love, I still buy it on Bandcamp. I might never download it even to my computer, but I just want to try and support them. And, that way when I'm streaming something, Spotify for me is more just a convenience. I have you probably have a huge music catalog. It wouldn't all fit on my phone at all, so, the stuff that's not on Spotify or iTunes, I keep on my phone and then I just stream it, not feeling so guilty about the fact that, somebody's getting ripped off, by this. But it's just like, what's the alternative? Don't put it on Spotify and let nobody listen to it. I mean, I'd rather have people listen to it than not listen to it in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I didn't start a mandolin podcast or spend a bunch of my money to make a mandolin duet record of non-bluegrass songs to make millions of dollars. You know what I mean? I would have probably tried to do something. I mean, I tried to get on Southern Charm.
There you go. You'll be an influencer before you know it.
Yeah, we'll see.
Well, Daniel, thank you. The album is incredible. I mean, you sent me the link and I was blown away by the lineup. I was blown away by the songs you chose and then the arrangements. I mean, it's just really creative. It's really cool. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me on. This is my Rolling Stone. You know what I mean? Like for real, I mean, I've been, I worked at a big bookstore. So I remember seeing the first time Fretboard Journal kind of came out and just, we talked about this when you were on, but it was like this classy, cool magazine with all of my favorite people. And in a very similar way, a lot of the people you would put on the cover, maybe you wouldn't sell as many copies as John Mayer on the cover of the magazine would, but you didn't, that wasn't your MO. And I respect that so much, and that was, so yeah, I just love what you do. And I loved that,
you could see these players that, maybe 90% of the people I know might not be familiar with, but I couldn't wait to buy the copy and read it, So I love what you do. And it's just an absolute honor to be on here.
Oh, well, thank you. And I love what you're doing on the Mandolins Beer Podcast. So keep
so
those
much.
coming. Yeah.
But definitely. And hopefully I can book there's some mandolin players on the West Coast, man. I would love to get up to, I'm sure there's some breweries in Seattle. And
the wheels are already turning in my head if you really want that to happen. So we'll talk offline.
I 100% want that to happen. And I got to see that prep. I got to see the Bill Frisell room.
Exactly. Not much to it, let me tell you.
That doesn't matter. Thanks so much for having me, Jason.
All right. Thanks, Daniel. All right. That was my conversation with Daniel Patrick. I hope you enjoyed it. Nobody ever gives me feedback. Send me emails to podcast@fretboardjournal.com if you love it, or you can leave a review over on Apple Podcasts. Tell the world how much you love this show. Stay tuned. We've got all sorts of new announcements. There's a new Truth About Vintage Jams podcast dropping right now, and so much more. Thanks as always for being a part of the Fretboard Journal community.